Welcome back to our Utah Citizen Summit today. One of the joys and terrors of American democracy is that our nation's leaders come not appointed from God, but by ourselves. Today we have some of our own leaders, both in the community and politically from across the spectrum, that we're really delighted to have a chance to listen in on a conversation they'll be having together, also taking some questions. Natalie Gochner, who's Associate Dean of the Business School at the University of Utah and also Director of the University of Utah Kem C. Gardner Policy Institute, will be helping facilitate this. And that's good news because she practices this kind of thing on a show called Both Sides of the Aisle, where she gets left-leaning, right-leaning folks together and talking in generous ways. So we're really grateful to her kind of leading us along and for all of you taking time to be with us today. This morning, we met just as citizens in small groups, talking about what this last week has meant for us. And as you can see on the wall over there, the different feelings are across the spectrum. And we had a diversity of different perspectives and had a really great chance to reflect. Among other things, this panel will be reflecting on some of what came up this morning, so it's kind of a seamless continuity throughout the day. So without further ado, thank you.
Thanks, Jacob. Appreciate it. Well, welcome, everybody. Great to be with you today. Good afternoon. You are at the Thomas S. Monson Center, and I thought I'd just tell you just a tiny bit about that. This is an embassy for the University of Utah downtown. And this is a community gathering place where the university hopes to inspire thoughtful conversations that help us build a better community. So how fitting is it that we're here today to do that? This was certainly a contentious election season. And there were people here all morning, many of you participated in it, discussing how we could have, and excuse me, that is my phone. Just a good reminder to turn off your phone. Discussing how we could have a more civil, compassionate, inclusive, and productive society. You hear terms like hyper-partisan, trans-partisan, post-partisan, or just purely partisan. Those are things that we want to get past when we talk about civil communities. I have a terrific panel up here, and I know many of you know some of the folks up here. But let me just kind of describe who they are, and then I'm going to read a poem to you. So sitting to my left, Mayor Ben McAdams. Ben was recently reelected to a second term serving as Salt Lake County Mayor. He's highly regarded for how he works collaboratively across party lines to build a better community. Ben is also, and I think I have this right, a native Utahn and a family man. I know I have that right. He and his wife enjoy hiking. They have 4 children. He spends a lot of mornings on the soccer fields. He told me today he went to IKEA because he's been waiting till after the election to have some time. Ben, thanks for being here. Let's give him a hand. Sitting next to Ben is Michelle Oldroyd. She's an attorney who specializes in designing and facilitating dispute resolution processes. She's the former Administrative Dispute Resolution Administrator for U.S. District Court of Utah. She's a law professor at the University of Utah. She also now directs the Lieutenant Governor's Commission on Civil and Character Education. Michelle is a highly articulate proponent of dialogue, deliberation, and civic engagement. Thank you, Michelle, for joining us today. Becky Edwards is a Republican who represents District 20 in Davis County and also was recently reelected. And she, too, has a history of problem solving in the Utah legislature, works well with everyone I know. This isn't surprising since she is a former marriage and family therapist. So we thought she'd be great to have on the panel today. Join me in welcoming Becky Edwards. Sim Gill is with us, the Salt Lake District Attorney. Sim has a reputation for straight talk and even-handedness. He's a veteran prosecutor and has long been an advocate of focusing on collaborative and community-oriented approaches to problem solving. My father-in-law, when I go to the 4th of July parade, yells out to Sim Gill. He likes him so much. Please join me in thanking Sim for taking time with us today. And then we have Catherine Stokes. Catherine moved to Salt Lake City from Chicago after her retirement. She had a professional life in public service, if I have this right, with the State Health Department in Illinois. She's involved in the community and is committed to inspiring a more civil and compassionate society. She brings a very valued perspective to our panel. Please join me in welcoming Kathy. So many of you know that saying. They say that politics is about poetry and governing is about prose. Do you remember that? Kind of think about it. Let's hope that's true. Peggy Noonan had a Wall Street Journal column just yesterday where she started with a poem. And I want to just read this poem to you, and then we're going to ask our panelists to comment. This poem is by Stephen Vincent Benet, and it reads like this. It's not too long, by the way. Sometimes there comes a crack in time itself. Sometimes the earth is torn by something blind. Call it the Moors, call it God or fate. That force exists and moves. And when it moves, it will employ a hard and actual stone to batter into bits an actual wall and change the actual scheme of things. Wow. Okay, so leave it to Peggy Noonan to find and pick something like that to get us thinking. I want to just start by asking each of our panelists to just take a minute or two and reflect upon the current state of our nation and the stone that's been changing everything. And we'll start over there with you, Kathy, and then move this way.
Thank you. And the last shall be first, huh? Okay. This nation is a great and glorious nation that has a history that really deserves to be known. It's done some horrible things, starting with the indigenous people, slavery, the Chinese who built the railroads, the Japanese who, some of whom were housed not too far from here. And yet, it is recognized as the shining example of democracy and opportunity. And it is all those things. Unless we face the reality of who we are, I do not believe that we will get to the best place where we can be. History, unknown and not understood, is apt to be repeated. And we continue to make errors over and over again. Now, can we say something about the election?
I'm told that that's fair game.
Okay. I tell you with no joy that I bet 3 of my friends that still live in Chicago that Trump was going to win. Not because I wanted that to happen, but because there are more people in America who hate and think the cause of their lack or lacks is the fault of people who don't look like them. Now, as a black 80-year-old woman, descendant of slaves, Americans today do not know our history, do not realize the outcomes of slavery. The South understands that because it took a Southerner, Lyndon Baines Johnson, to do the Civil Rights Act of the 60s, which cost him the South, which then moved to the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. Unless we confront, and not in an uncivil way, but confront who we are and understand what all of this means, all we're going to do is maintain a surface civility. That enough?
Yeah, that's great. We'll develop it more.
Okay.
Is my mic picking up in the back? We're okay? Okay, great. Sim, let's hear you comment on the state of our nation and what's going on right now.
Well, since we're going to have a lot of time to talk, but let me just give it sort of a very sort of existential kind of urgency I think that we're feeling. If we were to take a temperature right now, there is a lot of hurt, there's a lot of confusion, there is joy in some, there is hope in others, there is a level of frustration, but all collectively, I think there is a sense of saying and asking really for the first time that the promise of the American dream, the promise of what America stands for, were we wrong about it? What is our definition of it? What I believed in, is that something that was in isolation to just myself, or is that something that was being shared by a larger community? What does it mean to be living in a society where you don't feel part of that community? Community is a huge sense of what I think America is all about. And I think right now there's a deep sense of fragmentation that people are experiencing. People who voted for one side felt that they were alienated from the other side. And the other side, which is fighting very desperately for their beliefs, feels like that they're being alienated by the other side. There's a sense of not belonging together, a lack of cohesiveness, a disjointedness, which has been fermenting for a long time. This election is simply the one thing, event that pushed it into a public way that we can no longer ignore it anymore. This is a conversation that has been long overdue. It has been for a long time being pushed to the sides by policymakers, by good intentions. But poverty, homelessness, mass incarceration, the environment, a sense of social and economic mobility, economic opportunity, the inheritance for future generations. These are not academic issues. These are very existential issues for people on a daily basis. And if there is one thing to be taken away from what people are feeling right now, and let me tell you, if there's this idea that somehow this is an either-or proposition, one side is here and the other side is there, and then there's this big divide, I would beg to differ with that. What you have are a lot of communities that are overlapping in different kinds of interests and a sense of alienation and a sense of loss, which I may have with one person over here and a total one over there. But the one common theme is that a non-responsive government, a sense of alienation, not being heard, and the things that are most near and dear to us that we hold personally, not having a capacity to articulate it to someone who's willing to, in a responsible way, listen to it. So there's a sense of loss here from many different perspectives. But there's also an opportunity here, if we listen to each other, to say that there has to be a better way. Because what the last political process was, and it doesn't matter which side of the conversation you were on, nobody can in a deep, genuine, honest way say that that political process was the best defining moment of who we are as a nation and what we hold up as an ideal for the world to emulate. Because there is the world who watches, and we are out there acting for it. And what was being shown and what was being described and what was happening there did not connect with who we are on an individual level. And the truthfulness and the honesty of who, if we go to our own soul, it did not connect. And every single one of us felt alienated from that. And here is an opportunity, because I think the frustration that we're feeling, is to say this cannot be the defining moment of who we are as a nation and who we are as a people. And this is not the message that we want to communicate. And I don't care what your political affiliation is. We can struggle through any of it and all of it. But the frustration is feeling disconnected from your government, feeling alienated from your community, and not being heard. That's where we are. And it is an opportunity. It's a sad moment collectively, but an opportunity to move forward.
Very good. Becky, let's hear your take.
You know, I come to this from a perspective of a grandmother of 5 children, 5 grandchildren, and my oldest granddaughter just turned 10 in the middle of this campaign season. And when she was 6, she's sort of precocious, and we had lots of conversations about what Romney and Obama were going to do to NASA funding. She's really into space. And so she's 6, and she was trying to decide who she was going to support. And that was her big issue. Who was going to support space because she wants to go to Mars? And so fast forward 4 years, now we're in this campaign, and lots of conversations that we're having, none of it policy driven, all about the things she's seen on the news that we're all seeing, that she's talking to her classmates about. And one of her proudest moments, she reported to me they had an election in her class on the election day, and she was able to convince everyone in her class to vote for Jill Stein. So she won Centerville Elementary 4th grade. So there you have that, at least, for whatever reason. Anyway, her through conversations with her, and of course many others, I look at this election and I can see that many of us are in a sense of mourning for what our better selves are and what we expect of ourselves in many cases, our conversations we have with neighbors, but most importantly, our elected officials. And I think for too long we've assigned the role of an elected official simply as someone who, I'm in the state legislature, so we have 2 jobs. One is pass the budget and make the laws. And we do a fairly good job at both of those things. But we've got to transcend that role definition and include being a better example, being better mentors, being better examples of civil dialogue, of humanness, of being the type of people that we want to see. We don't see that at many levels of government. And I think part of that is we don't expect that of our leaders. We are happy to see a different role for them, but I think that one of the things that would help move us forward in terms of having better conversations, bringing groups together, having more effective conversations of how we are going to deal with some of the big issues, socioeconomic mobility, poverty, these kinds of things that really impact many of us, is to expect a better, higher dialogue from our elected officials at every level, and to embrace that when we see it. That doesn't always get the news. It doesn't always get you, a lot of praise as an elected official, but to acknowledge and expect and embrace and reward behavior like that when we see it in our policy makers. That's one perspective on that part of it, at least.
Great point. Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to join this panel and to discuss the election in a way that the election wasn't held. It's an interesting opportunity to reflect on our public processes, both as a citizen, as a parent, as a teacher, and a lawyer. For me, I bring all of those hats to just about everything I do. And my first instinct about the election was that we lost our civic faith. We come to being Americans as spiritual people, and we bring our religious faith to the table, we bring our humanity to the table, we bring our partisanship to the table. And what I watched my colleagues and fellow voters do was lose their civic faith in the last election cycle. We didn't explore how deeply we love and abide by who we are as a country and understand that that's an idea. We did not bring process to be celebrated. We in fact averted process at every turn. We shunned actual legitimate process, and instead of having debate, which is actually good, dissent is lovely and deeply American. Instead of having rigorous, meaningful debate, we had attack and defensiveness. And there's a concern for me that we are going to now start wholeheartedly abandoning process and wholeheartedly abandoning a faith, a civic, secular faith in who we are. And if we lose sight of that compass point, I am fearful for what we hand to the next generation. Not the generation here who is about to assume the cusp of leadership, but the generation outside of here who's sitting in an elementary school classroom worried about their colleagues, their neighbors, their friends, their parents. And they're worried because they've heard it and they've seen it, not because they got to vote. The unheard populations who either didn't vote or couldn't vote are now afraid in a palpable way. And that is not an American feeling that I understand. I don't wake up in my bed afraid. And so to know that that is a pervasive feeling as an American makes me feel a sense of duty. And what I'm hoping comes out of the election is that. I've been teasing that I want to play the Pirates of Penzance everywhere I go now, to call upon my brothers and sisters to find that sense of civic duty. And I, quite frankly, don't care what it looks like. If it's mowing a lawn, if it's caring for the elderly, if it's visiting someone in a care center, if it's caring about an issue deeply that you feel passionate and partisan about, I kind of don't care what the mantle is. I just think now is the call to arms to pick it up, to find it, to engage with it, to fully live out your citizenship, not every 4 years, but as many minutes as you can find to live it out within the day.
Mayor McAdams, bring us home.
Thank you. You know, I heard a pundit say after the election that the media took Trump literally, but not seriously. And the Trump voters took Trump seriously, but not literally. I think we're still processing. I know in our household we're still processing. I don't know what this election means. I think the question was, what is the state of our nation? I think we don't know. I think some things we know right now is we are deeply troubled and deeply divided. And that's true, I think, regardless of how this election had come out. We have a president who did not win the popular vote, but won the electoral vote. And yet, some of what I'm hearing is, in our office, we're getting calls from many refugee families, new Americans, and others who are saying we're afraid, who are taking him literally and seriously, and wondering what their future holds. Are they going to be forced to leave this country? Are they going to be employable? Are they going to be able to secure the rights as Americans that they're entitled to? And I think that fear is deep. Whether that fear, I think many, probably even many who voted for Trump, I did not, but many who voted for Trump are believing that and hoping that many of the things that were said on the campaign trail were just that he's not intending to follow through on them, that they were intended to be an election tool, but not real legitimate policy. And I think that's a little bit of a sad state to be in, where what we are hoping and expecting is that our newly elected president will not fulfill his campaign promises, is the best that we're hoping for. I remember a quote from that Bill Clinton said when he was president, that there's nothing wrong with America that cannot be fixed by what is right with America. I find myself today, and I think, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I find myself questioning that statement. Is what's right and good with America enough to help us overcome what is wrong with America? And we have, there's something that's deeply wrong, and it's with America, and people are troubled, and people are hurt, people are afraid, and this goes for both sides of the aisle, or the many sides. We're in a transpartisan, so the many perspectives. People are hurt, people are afraid, people have lost hope for the future, and I think that's the question. I think we can spend a lot of time discussing why the election turned out the way that it did. And I think it's, but for less than 1% of votes that may have shifted the other way, it would be a different conversation today. So it was a very close election. But why did it happen the way that it was? Doesn't mean that 55% of America is deeply troubled, but there is that sliver in the middle that is troubled and hurt and afraid, and they're both Democrats and Republicans and independents. And I think we can have and we will, for many years, have discussions about what happened and why did it turn out the way that it did. I think there's also the conversation about what's next for America.
Thank you. Really, you can see why we have this panel, because we're getting some just terrific perspectives. And we're going to move to some hopeful things towards the end and different things, but I want to continue to establish the context and the perspective that we're in right now. And I want to tell you that I was in Washington, D.C. recently, and I learned this quote, or this new word I'd never heard before. It's a Greek word, and it's kakistocracy. Seeing if people know that word, kakistocracy. Sounds Greek. It is government run by the least qualified and least principled. They actually have a word. So, with that kind of in mind, I want to ask Sim Gill this question, at least start with you if others want to weigh in. But, people are talking about the rot in America, R-O-T, decay. Rot could be defined as a federal government that's not working anymore. Nothing gets done. It's dysfunctional. Rot could be defined as a whole group of Americans who this economy is not working for. And Sim, I wanted to start with you because you get to see some of the toughest things in our society. And I wanted you to just comment on that general topic of the decay that exists in America.
That's a good question, and it's kind of interesting because when you think about like what I do as a public prosecutor, we immediately sort of think about that people who are there, maybe the decay or rot of society. But let me sort of give you a little different nuance on that, because I think you're right. I on a daily basis, see incredible violence. I see incredible nasty things that are done to human beings by other human beings. But through that pain, I also see some incredible courage. I also see incredible resiliency. I see incredible compassion and generosity. But you're right, and I've said it this way. Here's my hypothesis. And my hypothesis is when the policymakers fail to address issues of social justice, economic justice, political justice, public health, environmental health, those public policy failures manifest themselves as crises in our community. And historically, we've looked to law enforcement to be the response to those dysfunctions in society and those crises. And so as a result, in the criminal justice system, I end up with people who are mentally ill, people who are drug addicted, people who are on the verge of poverty, people who have been forgotten, people who are been marginalized, people who have been warehoused, and people who the promise of American democracy has forgotten. And as a result, you look to the criminal justice system as this mechanism. And so in a way, I guess we could say, well, is that the rot of society, or is it the consequence of rot in our society? Because if those public policy perspectives had been met, then maybe the numbers that I'm dealing would be substantially smaller. And so that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is that when I think about it in the broader sense of it, there is a disconnect from people from each other. There is a disconnect from people on a human level. When you if after a period of time, you stop seeing yourself as a human, you start seeing others not as human because of the hardship and the institutionalization that occurs. So, for me, it's been a very interesting perspective, a lens from where I look at it. I look at it from a perspective of public policy failure. And then I'm being asked to respond to that public policy failure because it makes us feel good that somehow we're responding. For me, there is a whole canopy of public policy failures that we have. But that also means that there's a responsibility that goes beyond the individual. Yes, those individual people who are committing those crimes, yes, they're held accountable. But we are not holding accountable at the same time those individuals whose public policy failures are having collateral and direct consequences on this population as they find themselves navigating through a system, the only system that's responding to them and recognizes and sees them, even in a negative way. So is there a rot in our society? Yes, there is, but the rot runs the full continuum. It just doesn't end up in one part of or one segment of society.
Very good. I don't know if others want to comment on that, but Ben, I'll come to you. Some people have characterized this as a divide between the protected and the unprotected. So just a way to think of it. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, when I think about this, I think of what Michelle said in her introduction. But the rot, I don't think that of human beings in our society as the rot. But I think what the rot is a lack of belief in the process. And it maybe starts with the federal government that doesn't function. But are we at a point where, I think before we would be disappointed in an outcome, you may be disappointed in an election, but you believe that a good process will ultimately yield to a good outcome. And I think that there's, a loss of a civic faith, is that a loss in a belief that the process will ultimately bend us toward justice and equality and opportunity. And that if the process is broken, that's where you get to the point where I think what we saw in this last election is we're throwing bricks through the windows instead of engaging passionately in the process. We are walking away from the process, and that's the rot that I feel. And how do you restore that trust and belief in a process that works and will? I may have come out on the short end of the process, but I'm going to continue to engage in the process because there's the next time.
I feel the need to just make sure it was clear that what I meant by saying rot was not individuals. It was dysfunction in Washington and an economy that wasn't working, just to be really clear about that, but good points. Anyone else want to comment on that? Kathy, do you have something you want to add?
Well, I don't want to get into the semantics of rot, but as Mr. Gill said, it runs the gamut. Now, I will believe that it does not run to individuals or communities when a community steps up and says, put the homeless shelter here. They can't find a place to put it. I don't want them on my street. But if I can have some assurances that they will get the interventions they need and not just warehoused, I would say, yeah, there's a vacant space on South Temple down there. Can we put a homeless abodes or housing? We got to do away with homeless, the idea of homeless. And but for a government check, I might be homeless. That can befall any of us who lose financial footing. I don't care how much you have. You can lose it. So it's the individual, and I will say that the politician's first job is to get elected. So they have to accommodate, respond to the people who send them into those positions. So the response has to be at every level, every institution, every organization, community, and individuals. And I want to hasten to add, I am just really honored to sit on this platform with two of these politicians. I think they are wonderful, competent, honest, and they happen to be men. I'm not in Davis County. Hey,
You're saying
I'm-
that they
I'm- you know-
represent you.
huh?
And you're saying that yeah,
Yeah,
Becky's not your
right.
representative.
You
yeah.
know, this is our first time of meeting. But if we have more, we need, everybody uses diversity to cover whatever they're thinking and don't want to say. We need more women in these positions. We need a woman to be head of the Department of Defense. We won't be sending babies to die in the Middle East in the same way. Well, we need that diversity. You know, we need the different races represented. We certainly need our American Indians represented, and our children who have lived here all their lives. You talk about immigrants, except for the American Indians and those they brought over here on slave ships, all y'all immigrants. Okay.
I want to get the other two women on the panel to talk about something. One, Becky Edwards, of course, is a politician, and Michelle is a professional mediator. And I want to share an Arthur Brooks quote. So Arthur Brooks runs the American Enterprise Institute, very thoughtful man. He said this, he said, "Politicians don't start parades. They find them, run up front, and march in them." I want you to just think about that for a minute. You know, and everyone could take that differently, but the way I take it is the people actually get to decide these things. So let's start with the elected official. Becky, just, you know, anything you want to say and that you've heard on the panel, but also about this idea that politicians don't start parades. They just find the front and march in them.
I think it's important to remember that when you're elected, you really are a representative of the people who have elected you. And whether that's Salt Lake County or you know, your individual town or legislative district, and your effectiveness is only really as strong as your efforts that you put into communicating with the people who have elected you. You can't run up to the head of the parade unless you know where people are marching and what their issues are and what their values and things that are important to them. You can do a lot as an elected official to bring information and experiences and educate the people that have elected you. In my area of Davis County, many of the issues that I feel like are most important are not necessarily the strongest priorities of the people in my district. But I am slowly making them aware of how important they are. Issues of homelessness and affordable housing and these things I think are incredibly important. And you have a mechanism to educate and inform and have dialogue with the people that elect you. And that's one of the really important roles you have, and really a great privilege as well. I know that as an elected official, one of the things that's always a challenge is to step away from the concept of otherness and saying it's those people, and even the way you frame a conversation can create an us and them or a sense of otherness in communities. That's not helpful. It's not, and the more we can move to talking less about each other and talking more with each other, those are helpful shifts in perspective. I think we get better policies when we do more of that. I know the past couple of years in the Utah State Legislature, we've done a lot with justice reform. And for me, experiences that I was having as we were discussing this as policymakers, that I was having from a church standpoint, where I was in the Salt Lake County Jail, dealing with and having the experience of helping individuals transition from the Salt Lake County Jail into finding a place to live and a job, really informed my perspective on this issue tremendously. And I was able to now have an experience that was very unique amongst my 75 House colleagues and share that with them in a way that was different than their perspective. And that experience that you have and the conversations that you have are incredibly important, and if you don't make that effort, you're not in a position to bring, I think, a breadth and a depth of conversation.
Can you read the quote again? I want.
Politicians don't start parades. They find them, run up front, and march in them. Is that what you're doing, Ben?
Well, some of us buy orange buses and stand on top of them in the parade. So,
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good.
you know, I think thinking about that quote. So I think I would say it would be correct to say Trump didn't start a movement. The movement was there, the sentiment was there, the frustration and anger was there. He just became the expression of that. The parade
I
didn't.
think that's what it's pointing
yeah.
to, yeah.
But you know, I want to maybe say that I think that there's some truth to that. I think there's I often say I think there are two types of politicians. There's a thermostat and a thermometer. A thermometer is a tool that will tell you what the temperature is in the room, and a thermostat will change the temperature in the room. And sometimes our job is to be a thermostat, or a thermometer, is to reflect the mood of our constituents. But sometimes our job is to be a thermostat, and is to change the temperature in the room. And I think there are good examples of that as well. Probably a thermometer is the same thing as a parade. But the thermostat, I think of what we did as Utahns, Republicans and Democrats, around non-discrimination and religious liberties. The overwhelming mood of the public was supporting. So we, for those of you who aren't Utahns or maybe, but passed legislation protecting against discrimination in housing and employment for LGBT Utahns, and did it in a way with support from our religious communities. And you know, when that conversation started, the public didn't support that. If we were leaders of a parade or thermometers, that would not have happened. But we had many people. I'm proud to be one of them. I think all of you have been one of them, participating in this conversation, being thermostats. And we changed the temperature in the room today, that we passed legislation with overwhelming public support and legislative support. We've done that in several contexts, and I hope that that's what today's a little bit about, is maybe what is the parade, but also where do we want to set the thermostat?
Michelle, you can close this down, and then
Sure.
I want to do one more thing that's kind of on the hard stuff, and then we're going to start talking about solutions.
So I think Brooks is actually reflecting on leadership in his quote, and that's what immediately came to mind, is what really constitutes the leader, coming from within the group or running to find the front of it once you see the group assembled. And I actually think the meaning of leadership is a combination of character and competence. So it's not just the instinct to go run to the front. There's something else there that constitutes really sound leadership. And I actually think it's, and I don't know if it's because I intended to be alliterative, that it's 3 C's, but I added civility in my note, and I just saw that. But I think of civility as the sort of third-tier component to the two sides of both who you are and what you know. And the combination of them then is your process of how to deliver that. And that really is the hallmark of your leadership, is how you bring about the manifestation of those two things. Not just your academic and rigorous understanding, but the experience of who you are and the genuineness and authenticity of who you are in your character. And for me, the hallmark of civility always, I go back to a quote. I'm going to share a quote back in my response. To Stephen L. Carter, a lawyer and law professor out of Yale, who talks about civility as the idea of listening, not with the intention of being right, but with the knowledge that you just might be wrong. And the need to actually acquire as part of who you are as a listener. For me, it is that third-tier component, that extra piece of how you deliver your message and how you are experienced in delivering that message, that really is the touchstone of the effectiveness of your leadership.
Michelle, will you say that quote one more time?
Sure. I'm paraphrasing.
Okay, that's
I'm
great.
remembering the quote because I say it differently at different times. But civility is not, it's about listening, not with the intention that you are right, but with the notion that you just might be wrong. And every time I use it, see it, read it, I know I'm reading it differently. I know I'm instilling it differently in who I am or the work that I'm applying the reference to. But there's something so deeply meaningful about that for me.
Yeah, that's great. Looks like Kathy wants to say something. Yeah, that's just fine.
I'm reminded of, was it Maslow's hierarchy of needs that I learned about in college. Huh? Oh, they don't teach it anymore. I told you I was 80, hey. But it's that thing where if you are just surviving, you don't generally care too much about entertainment. It's like our problem with fathers. How can you be a father if you can't provide food and shelter for your children because you don't have a living wage? So in the conversation, I'm asking how you have those conversations or with people who don't have a place to live. You could probably have them with people incarcerated because they don't got nothing else to do. But how do you, it's almost like, how do you heal a broken heart? I don't know, but I ask it because I'm trying to see how what I've heard here today, and I have to admit, I was a little skeptical when that tall, handsome guy was talking about taking a deep breath. Are you kidding me? You know? You take a deep breath before you walk through down on 2nd South at about 5th. You take a deep breath and that someone, I've heard this before in regard to the police. And let me say, most police are honorable, good, courageous people. But we expect them to be social workers. We expect them to be psychologists. And we expect them to apply law enforcement to social problems and psychiatric problems and God knows what else. So this is not an easy task that is set before us. We have, I believe, in America, the greatest, you know, I'm believing that, I'm drinking the Kool-Aid, the greatest country in the world. We have the resource. Do we have the commitment?
One more, let's do it.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Sid.
I want to touch upon what Ms. Kathy said here because I think that's important. Because when you think about this last election, there was a attempt almost at an academic and intellectual level to kind of describe what was going on without really understanding at an existential or a personal level the reality of what people were feeling. And so when you think about the overlap, because if you think about it in purely political terms, the greatest shifting and realignment is occurring in our political process, right? Because if you go back 20 or 30 years, it was the college-educated individuals who were more often connected with the Republican Party, and the working poor were connected with the Democratic Party. And if you come back and go forward from the last 40 years to now, you notice that there's a different alignment that's occurring in that sense. And so when you talk about what Ms. Kathy's talking about here is that unless you kind of feel, we can talk past each other in an academic sense. We can be descriptively be very smart about the explanations that we're giving. But if you're a coal miner in Pennsylvania, okay, if you're a poor person who cannot seem to get a job after the 15th application that you put in, if you're a person who's struggling to figure out how to make ends meet, or a person who is struggling to find how to pay the electric bill, let alone be able to turn on the TV to get and hear the political dialogue, right? That's a reality that sometimes in an academic exercise we have forgotten. There is a humanity, a citizenship there that is hungry to be seen and to be heard, to be engaged in, to be conversed with, to have you say to them that what you're feeling, what you're suffering, may not fit the academic definition, but is nonetheless existentially very real to you. And as politicians and policy makers, we forgot that part of that conversation. Okay? So it's not that Trump sort of, even whether it's true or not, those individuals who voted for Trump said he was in the crowd and were pushing him to the front of the parade. Even though he may, for some of us, that ran to the front of the parade and exploited that fear. But for them, they're not saying that he ran up. For them, they feel connected that they actually pushed him to the front. And that is a very powerful feeling to have. Okay? Whatever his message was, I hear you, when other people were not hearing them. And I think that's why what Miss Kathy said is so important, that we need to recognize sometime that conversation, that capacity to see the other person as the person and to feel what they're feeling and validate what they're saying, even if you disagree with them, is such a basic human need that if we don't do it, then we do it at our own peril, as this sort of political process is demonstrating most recently.
It's fascinating. Many of you know, and those that don't know, we spent the morning here and had a great discussion and broke up into groups of 6 and talked about these issues. In my notes here, we talked about reaching out to people who disagree with you. We talked about the power of face-to-face contact. Some of these themes are coming out in this discussion. But I want to share 2 kind of sobering anecdotes and get our panelists to comment on them from this perspective. Taking responsibility for other people's fears. Taking responsibility for other people's fears. That was one of the themes that came out of this morning's discussions. So we had someone in this morning's discussions that made the comment that she feels sexually harassed in her work setting every day. That's not a sobering enough comment. And then I'm just pulling a personal anecdote here, but I got a text, and everyone has their own of these, but I'm just going to put 2 out there and then ask you to comment on them. I got a text from my niece yesterday. She said, "Natalie, I talked to 3 Muslim women today that are terrified by Trump being elected. Many feel vulnerable and that they are hated by Americans. Many worry they will be sent back home. They also have children being bullied at school. Quote, you will be gone soon. Trump is sending terrorists back," unquote. She says this, "Today was very sobering in the refugee community. If you have any pull for a local public official to make a statement about the contributions that Muslims make in our local community and that they have friends and advocates here in Utah, it might be helpful." So this is just, one of my little anecdotes. You all had them. I wanted to just ask, and anyone who wants to jump in here, but how do we take responsibility for other people's fears? The idea is we may not have this fear. You may not feel sexually harassed, right? But how do you take responsibility for the fears of other people?
I'll start the ball rolling, I guess.
Start the ball rolling.
What instantly comes to mind for me when you talk about people being afraid, and I suppose it's a reference to what Sim mentioned earlier, is the notion that our law enforcement and our courts are sort of our ERs. They're dealing with the heightened fear of our community and dealing with the most vulnerable issues. And I am the daughter of a cop, and I am the daughter of a school teacher. And I think what we've forgotten in our conversation about how to deal with fear is that we are capable of simultaneously holding 2 things that oppose each other. We are deeply capable people, and we can hold 2 opposite ideas at the exact same moment. For example, a police officer at the end of the day can return home following his or her shift, and a young person who is troublesome or even troubled and experiencing that out loud and in color in our communities by their actions, by their words, by their very participation in whatever their community is going through, can also simultaneously return home to their families at the end of the day. We no longer, as responsible parties, have to hold one extreme. We now have to start to widen our capacity and hold 2 or 10, as the case may be. And our conversation, our language is so confined to one position or to partisanship as two things that I feel like we need to teach to the next generation and encourage ourselves to live up to the example of simultaneously doing the hard piece of holding opposites, holding extremes, holding multitudes of points of view, and still acting. And again, I'm going to refer to a quote. I guess I'm a huge fan of language, and I love quotes and stories for how they inform who we are now. And I recall a Teddy Roosevelt quote, and I sort of picture him sort of bolden on a horse while he's saying this. I know that's probably not so. He was probably in an office at a desk, but the best thing to do is the right thing. The next best thing to do is the wrong thing. The worst thing to do, though, is nothing. And I believe we are at a time where nothingness and emptiness and excuses and lacking, it can no longer afford to be our perspective. But the width and breadth of who we are has to expand now to the fullest capacity of what this moment in time demands. Our children are clamoring for it, the populations you describe are clamoring for it, and not a one of us in this room can't assign ourselves to a pool of people who are afraid for a given reason. Every single one of us could tap that in a certain way, could tap that fear from some group we belong to. So I challenge us, I guess, in our language to expand and in our capacity of who we are and what we think we can do to just push the boundaries, to push the creativity and innovation, and even the willingness to explore. I love the notion of your 6-year-old granddaughter going to Mars as just this idea of who we are and what we bring. That is so deeply American to me, that we teach a young person that what you're voting for is whether or not you get to go to Mars. That's wild, because none of us pulled a lever thinking that, and yet that's what we're doing. And so I guess that's, my reflection on fear is we have to do more and better and all of it simultaneously, and we can.
Mr. Sim,
Okay.
taking
So-
responsibility
so-
for other people's fears.
Well, I think that's a great question. And, the Friday before the election, I got invited to the Utah Islamic Center, their annual sort of banquet, and they wanted me to come down and talk. And so I go, what do you want me to talk about? I've known the members from the community for many years, and they said, we just want you to come down and talk because you're the district attorney, and it's important for our community to see you come down. And that really meant a lot to me, because for them, so when we talk about taking responsibilities for other people's fears, let me put it to you 2 ways. There are 2 challenges. You don't need to be an elected person. First of all, it begins on an individual level. You know somebody who is Hispanic, Latino, Muslim, somebody who feels alienated from our process, somebody who may feel disconnected because they feel that the government or our community is not going to be respond to them in a favorable way. If you know that on an individual level, on a human level, we have the responsibility to tell them and give them comfort to say, no, we're in this together. You're a citizen, you're my neighbor, you're my friend. And I'm not going to be silent and let something happen to you. We're in this together. They're looking for that reassurance. And on an individual level, every single one of us has a role to play in that capacity. On a broader level, on an elected level, I think every single one of us, I don't care what party you're from, I don't care what political bent you're coming from, there is something we call the Constitution. There is a notion of what constitutes American ideals. And it is an elected. The promise of American democracy, I've said this too, is that it's not that when you win, you take care of the one who supported you. The promise of American democracy is that you go to the person who didn't vote for you, who didn't support you, and you walk up to them first and you say, you know what? The election's over, but you're part of my political concern. because in this position and this privilege that I have to represent you. So as electeds, we have an enormous responsibility to reach out to those communities that are feeling targeted, that are feeling in the zone of sort of fire there, and to reassure to them that they are part of our political concern. They're part of our constituency, that as citizens and as members of our community, that they will not be abandoned, that as a representative, that we will champion and protect them and advocate for them, and that a measure of justice is available to them. So the Friday before the election, that's what we talked about. And we talked about it in a truthful manner, right? So for example, there was a study that was done by Georgetown University, that March 2015 to March 2016, there were over 180 Muslim crimes that occurred, of which 12 resulted in murders. You have to talk about these things, but you also have to inform them and educate them that they will not be abandoned, that those kind of conducts that are being done in those individuals and those crimes, those are still seen as crime and people will be prosecuted, that they have a valid spot to own in this thing we call American society. Their citizenship and the color of their skin, their culture, their ethnicity, their religious belief does not disqualify them from every right and privilege of their citizenship. But they need us to say that and champion that for them. So I think we can alleviate other people's fears and take responsibility, because we have to tell them that those are not our ideals. The moment that you don't take responsibility for their fears, when you walk up and you say, you know what? Your fears are valid because you should be afraid. That's the worst thing we could say.
Very interesting. What do we call you? Miss Kathy.
And that's a hard thing to do. But let me tell you how you start. Stop ignoring them. Stop averting your eyes when you pass people on the street. A look is worth 10,000 words. I am from the South, and in the South, growing up, you spoke to everybody. In my building, there are, I think, 4 Muslim families. One couple has a little boy. Cute little boy. So when I went to Glacier, I got a lot of cookies that are made like the animals in Glacier, animal cookies. I went down to his apartment, and his mother came to the door, and I said to her, listen, I need to ask you something, because I do not want to offend in any way, but I have these cookies that I want your son to have, if that is okay with you. She cried. She was so hungry for somebody to notice her child. So it can be a nod. You know, you really don't have to, but a nod, but don't ignore folk. Except when you're in a situation where it might be a psychiatric thing. Do not go down on 2nd South and start nodding and smiling at folks. You know, you got think. Okay, but you start with small steps. And if a conversation ensues or a couple of words, that's fine. Now let me give you the benefit of living here in Utah and being black. A cop stopped me one day, and he looked at my address and he said, "You live on South Temple?" So then other people want to dissect you. You know, I don't know as much as I would like to know about the Muslim community, but I don't dissect them. You know, if you're going to ask folk all their business, tell them all yours first. You know, respect people's space and privacy, but acknowledge them. I think that is a great start that we can all do. And I think you'll feel more confident, it'll grow, you may say something, and children are wonderful to start conversations around.
Wonderful advice, and thanks for kind of getting us to the solutions part of thinking through this. I want to turn the time over to the audience, so think what your question might be, and someone will come up here and grab a microphone and bring it to you. As you think of that, let me just share one last quote from this Peggy Noonan piece. She concludes by saying that a Trump administration will be supported by three types of people: the loyalists, to the victor go the spoils; the opportunists, and she's reminding us that in Washington, D.C., there's always opportunists. I think you know what that might mean. But then she talks about the patriots. And she says, it is the patriots who matter, many of whom kept away from Mr. Trump in the past. They are needed now. They have heft, wisdom, experience, and insight. Donald Trump doesn't know how to be president. He isn't a reader of the presidency. He's never held office. There's little reason to believe he knows how to do this. The next president needs you. This is our country. Help him. So with that, let's go to questions. You can direct it to someone on the panelists or just throw it out there and we'll see who wants to respond.
So in the county, there's something called the diversity dinner, but it's just one night a year. And how could we move beyond that? Because I think that's, even in Utah, we're divided into our communities, and it's hard to be in other communities and to find that, and that really helps. I'm still in contact with the people that sat at my dinner 2 years ago. And so we get together, but how could we move beyond that?
I mean, thank you, Bev, for reminding us of that. We do an annual dinner where we invite, really open to anybody to come, and we randomly ask you to sit and meet new people. I was thought-provoked as people talk to. I think it relates to the question that we asked earlier about owning somebody else's fear, or maybe owning somebody's uncertainty, or
their life experience.
or life experiences, and how can we own somebody else's challenges and hopes? And I think that is a great example. I see one of my colleagues here, Z Zhao, or Z, raise your hand, who works with our refugee community. And I haven't spoken to Z in a few days, but I'm aware that Z and my office have received many calls from people in the community who are concerned and afraid. And, and what can we do to reassure them? I think, first of all, I think that there's constitutional protections for people. You can't, and so I don't think people are going to be forced to get on an airplane and go home. And I certainly wouldn't allow that. I would stand in the way, and I would stand with them, and I would own their fears and make them I would stand with them and work against that. I think that many Republicans and Democrats would stand with me in that regard. Bullying, how do we, I think the best tool against, I can't be everywhere. We can't be everywhere to stop bullying, but it's to help people understand how that hurts and help it be taught in the home. So I guess I don't know the answer, but I think that it is something that I'm thinking about. How can we, especially now, it's probably needed today more than ever, to help people know that they're not alone and they're not shouldering those fears and worries and challenges alone, that people in power will stand with them and work with them to help them to their fears to not become realities. But I don't know. I want to think about that some more.
I also want to add that from this morning, one of the themes was face-to-face contact as an important way to bring us together. Looks like we got another question here.
I'm going to do rapid shot here and give you some questions. What do the lawyers do now? What does K through 12 do? What does youth sports do? What does the interfaith community do? What are PTAs going to look like? What do PTAs do? Boots on the ground, judges, probation officers, immigration officials, people at the front desk of the Social Security Administration. I mean, this is so much bigger than one person. We are a huge community. I want to hear what your thoughts are. I'm very concerned about children right now.
Well, and I'll just say, I think when I first started seeing this summit come together, I think I envisioned how do we find consensus around healthcare reform. Those would be the topics we'd be talking about. How do we heal the divided nation around policy? And I think that the conversation today is centered around how do we help people not fear for their safety or fear for their economic security. It's a very different conversation. And I think you're right. I think that the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we can't talk about congressional agreement around healthcare reform when we have many of our residents who are afraid for their safety and their security. So maybe that is it. Maybe you're answering Bev's question too, that it's not just the mayors and the legislatures and the district attorneys who are assuring that we will stand with them to protect their safety, but it's the PTAs and it's the athletic teams, the sports teams that are inclusive, and we need to tap into what's right with America to fix what's wrong with America.
Others on the panelists.
I think each one of us has a sphere of influence in some way. If that's you mentioned sports or PTA or these kinds of things that really are boots on the ground in a community that goes statewide. We're sitting here in Salt Lake City and Salt Lake County, but these are issues that go into all the counties and small towns, and in many ways more in small towns throughout the state. So look at our sphere of influence and see how those could be enhanced by conversations around this issue. Be the change you want to see. Be the leader of a conversation that is elevated beyond what we see on the television, and start to help craft messages that can be reassuring, especially for children. I think, we know the impact on a child's neurodevelopment when they have adverse childhood experiences, right? Many of you probably are involved in efforts with children, so you're familiar with that concept. But this is an example of a stressful experience for children. They feel that. They're the temperature gauge in their families, so they feel that, and they hear it, and they're experiencing bullying in many cases, and parents are at a loss for how to explain what's happening to their children. And I think a sports coach, for instance, or a PTA president, they're worried that they're going to get it wrong. They're going to get the message wrong. But I saw a beautiful preschool lesson on post-election conversation, and it was a preschool in Oakland that was having a conversation. So these are 3-year-olds, and it was just the audio to it, but the questions were very simple, and this was a preschool teacher that probably was not expecting to instill a life lesson in a bunch of 3-year-olds that day, but the discussion centered around concepts that really become the basis for all of us as we look at this issue: love, embracing each other, and working together. And this teacher had the class practice hugging each other. And how do you feel when you show love and kindness? How does that make you feel? And this is simple, but that conversation and framing that and helping at every level, wherever your sphere of influence is, I think can make a big difference.
Sim, did you want to make a point?
I think your question was quite broad, and I think the answer is going to involve everybody in it. Whether every different phase of function that you have, again, I think your question asks that, and so I think certainly implies that we all have a role to play in it. But being a lawyer, and your question was, what did lawyers do? Well, first of all, what lawyers do is we're public servants and we're lawyers in that sense, but there's also private sector lawyers. And if there are wrongs being committed, then the private sector legal leadership needs to step up and say that we will make access to the courts available to you pro bono, because that's just the right thing to do. And in many communities around the world, when you look at fledgling democratic societies are emerging, it is the lawyers who step up and to push on what the civil rule of law ought to be. The biggest challenge right now, because when you think about it, there is a wonderful, with the National District Attorneys Association, there's a presentation that we do that was done about when in Hitler's time, when the SS came into power, how did civilian authorities convert to that? How did that transition look like? Because there was an isolated group of people, but it had to own those civilian institutions, and what was the role of each individual as they acquiesced to that power and to that way of thinking. So there is a transition period, and the rule of law becomes very important, both as a cultural issue and as a legal issue. And so you have a role to play in that, because when that initial authority comes in, it is taking the temperature to see if you're willing to acquiesce and abdicate your role of citizenship. And each one of us has a role to play in that. It's like somebody telling a racist joke, right? Somebody tells a racist joke into a crowd, assuming that the people who are the audience is going to go along. But the first person who stops that and says, hang on a second, that's unacceptable, and don't do that around me. That's a body check back to that person that will think twice about telling that racist joke in another crowd. So all of us have a role to play, and we will be tested in every capacity. The clerk who is there at the front at the grocery store and is either willing to help that Muslim woman in her hijab or not, is being tested, and people around are witnessing that. And if the question is, are we willing to risk at that moment to step forward to say and take responsibility as citizens, say, no, I will not let this happen, and I'm going to own my democracy, and I'm going to own my citizenship, and I'm going to own my ideals, and I'm going to express them at this moment as a citizen. That's our test. So every single moment of our time that we have an opportunity. You walk down that street, as Ms. Kathy says, whether you nod and acknowledge and smile, or grimace and turn mean eyes, every single step, whether it's at an institutional level or a personal level. But we now, and the time that you want to make that change, if that person's coming to you, then you will make the decision to either abdicate your citizenship or your ideals, or you won't. And nobody will know the difference but you. So we have to own it at every stage and at every opportunity.
We have, you're going to get an applause there, Sim. We have about 10 more minutes, so let's do a question over here. It looks like John's going to bring the mic over. Who's got it? There we go.
So some of my questions already been answered, especially by you, Sim, about just our role as citizens. And I think going back to this idea, I agree that, there's a loss of faith in the civic process. But I also, when you said that, kind of checked in with myself and thought, also, I think I can say that in some ways that's where I'm at, a loss of faith, but in the civic process, but really ultimately, kind of a little bit of a disappointment in myself of feeling dropped the ball, in my engagement in the civic process goes like this, as I'm sure it does for all of us. And it's a sense of overwhelm and do these small acts of, standing up for what we believe in, right? How I guess, how to deal with this sense of overwhelm and one step at a time. I don't know. I'm obviously overwhelmed. Where do we start?
I guess in part your question is to me because I mentioned the loss of civic faith, and I too have that same check. I have that same instinct because I'm a kid who sat at her living room table and watched presidential debates with a notebook from the time I can't remember when I didn't do that. And I love, this is like a total geek out moment for me because I love civics and the discussion of government and the discussion of history as a factual discussion, not just an academic discussion, but times, places, dates, people, all of that. But I also love this kind of human discussion of it. How does it impact you? What does it make you feel like? And And there is a part of me that is so struck by the idea that I could be someone who could lose civic faith. In fact, did I lose my civic faith? And my constant sort of back of my head, little girl in pigtails moment is no. I am going to rage against the loss of my civic faith loudly. I'm going to rage against it silently. I'm going to rage against it with boots on the ground in day-to-day moments. I'm going to find those drops in the bucket. And I am a firm believer that drops in the bucket matter. I don't know sometimes that I see it. I don't know that I experience the fullness of the bucket when it finally gets full. But I am a firm believer in the notion that it does get full, that we all do it, that it does matter, that if we're not making that contribution and we are expecting others to do it, we're in a bad way. We all have to make that contribution. And mind you, I am a firm believer of the idea that dissent is a drop in the bucket. I don't think that disagreeing with me is bad. I, in fact, want you to. And as a lawyer, I'll champion your chance to do it. I love this deeply American, and I firmly believe it is deeply American, this idea that we are the government that we want to create. And if we don't tap that notion in ourselves to expect it of others and then to expect it of our elected officials, there's a lack of genuineness there that, to me, bespeaks a loss and the rot that you're worried for, that I hope we never really find. That it is the drop in the bucket that truly matters, I think.
I think we have time for maybe just one more question, and I've nodded this gentleman at the back that it's coming his way, so I don't know, John, if that's okay with you.
Thank you. Appreciate this commentary. I too thought that healthcare was going to become the big issue after this election, and indeed, my reaction to the election was shock, like everybody else. And the second phase was to the now owners of policy in the United States. Be careful what you pray for. You just might get it. And on the healthcare side, we now have an administration with a president, a Congress, and a Senate that control healthcare in this country. And they get to make that decision. And we need to say, all right, it's yours. What are you going to do about pre-existing conditions? What are you going to do about the cost of health care? Because it's not really the insurance companies, it's the cost of the system itself. And I'd like comments on that, because I think that's where the rubber's going to meet the road. What happens with our entire healthcare system? You can't throw it out. You got to come in with something that works.
So here's a very, applied example of some of the change that could happen. And you mentioned the difference between campaign promises and what are you really going to do and whatnot. But let's get everyone to respond just real briefly to healthcare, if you would. And let's start with Becky, someone who's been involved in Medicaid expansion discussions in this state.
Right, so we've been talking about that for years, in Utah. And one of the things that I've heard that Trump is planning on doing is doing increased block grants to states. Now, if that happens, if we now have greater control over these dollars now, we will have to have a different kind of conversation than we've been having in the past. We'll have to really be a little more responsive, I think, to our citizenry. We'll have to look at the broader range of issues, in addition to the individuals that we've covered in the legislation we passed last year. But we'll be able to look at some of these things like cost curve and bending that and additional coverage, and really the ways we really want to function as Utahns and provide this incredibly important necessity for our families. So I think that's one of the things I've read Trump is planning on doing, promise, whatever. But there are incredible opportunities for us as a state to continue this conversation if, in fact, that happens.
you know, what's I find so interesting about your response, Becky, is it was hopeful. And, you know, people might react to that however they do. But we had this color coding in the earlier sessions. And if you look over there on the wall, you'll see the hopeful circle has a lot of dots in it. You know, which is an interesting reaction to how people are feeling that they're, but others who want to comment, looks like Kathy does.
I hope and pray that you're right. However, in terms of distribution of funds, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And they never passed Medicaid or any, so I hope you're right.
I'm excited for this because, just as the comment that was made, when you control the House and the Senate, it's very easy to now criticize and say, we're not going to do this. And I'm enough of a pragmatist to say that if you're not going to do it, then give me what your solution is to this. Because I'm not going to let you have a vacuum to say we're not going to do it, but then you've got to own the responsibility of not taking that action and show me what the substitute is. So the act of governing and the responsibility of governing has tremendous pressure when you get both houses. When you have the Senate and the House there, then you have to own that responsibility. We can't abdicate this. What I'm hoping is that we will have not an ideological conversation, but a pragmatic conversation. Utah's a very conservative place. I remember 3 years ago going to the Utah Association of Counties where we all meet down in St. George, and it's a big policy discussion thing. And I had a representative from Zions Bank graph, and I still see this graph, right? They talked about healthcare costs and per person expenditure. So they had all the countries of the world, and they had the money amount, so they were graphing it like this. And then you had all these countries, and there was a big pool, like there Canada, you had England, you had France, you had Germany, and then there was this one constellation like the North Star hanging out by itself, right? That was the United States of America. Even from an economic perspective, the conversation on dollars and cents, we have to have a truthful conversation, not an ideological one. And from an ideological perspective, we can't afford it, right? I trust my policymakers and I trust my legislatures because they're in a position of power to make that. What I can do with them is to just communicate what the reality is, right? So I'm a public prosecutor. I believe in full Medicaid expansion. And the reason I do is because 68 to 72% of the people sitting at the county jail right now would directly benefit from that. So if we're not going to do that, tell me how to take care of that 68 to 72%, which are being warehoused but don't have lack of a thing. So I'm excited because now I get to turn, and I really do believe this. You could be on the other side of the political spectrum, but you're still part of my political team, and we're part of responsible. So I'm going to turn to my Republican colleagues and say, give me the answer, because you have no more excuses.
Okay. Very good. Well, you're going to get the last word, so this is all going to work, but it's not coming yet. We're going to start with Kathy, and we just need to end this out, and I want to end on a positive note. I'm taught in my faith tradition that hope is an anchor to our souls. Hope is an anchor to our souls. So I'm going to try and limit y'all to one sentence, and I want to come all the way back to the mayor who can take 2 to 3 sentences. Give us hope. Tell us your hope for the future based on what we've talked about here today and what your own instincts and life experiences teach you.
From Proverbs, above all, get understanding, and charity never faileth.
Beautiful. Thank you. Sim?
Okay. The first thing we need to reach for is love. And from love comes compassion, and from compassion comes concern and care. And when I think about what is hopeful, I look at my father immigrating here in 1969 with $10 to his name, and it is the generosity of this community and of the friendships and everyone who knew us and didn't know us that made everything possible for me to continue to believe in the American dream and the ideals that brought us here. We did not come here as Republicans or Democrats. We came here to be American, and being an American still means something to me.
Believe in yourself, believe in your neighbors, and work together to be the change that you want to see.
Thank you, Becky. Jill.
So as a student of history, I think the most hopeful thing I find is our past. Resilience is a deeply American value. We have come through depression, we have come through civil war, we have come through all kinds of trouble, corrupt leadership, no leadership, every style of leadership known to humanity, and we are still here, and we are still a bastion of the idea that we want to be. We are that at our core. And so that for me is remarkably hopeful. We are a resilient people, and we will do this again. And I'll see you 4 years from now having voted for whomever, and we'll need to be resilient yet again. And that's good. That is good. That is deeply hopeful that we will still be here and still doing this again, and maybe even our children down the road having this summit.
Good. Let's get the last word from our good mayor.
One of the best parts of my job is I get to get out and see and meet so many different people from across this county, from so many different backgrounds. And my hope is we live in a great place and with a lot of good people and good hearts. And nobody who woke up this morning afraid or hurt or worried is alone. And they will see that in the next weeks and months as their neighbors and friends and strangers rally around them, that nobody's alone, and we live in a great place with a big heart.
Let's give our panelists a hand. It won't surprise you seeing this pile of papers in my lap that I have one more quote I want to share with you as we close this out. This is by New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman. He said, "America didn't become the richest country in the world by practicing socialism, or the strongest country in the world by denigrating its governing institutions, or the most talent-filled country by soaking fear of immigrants. It got here via the motto, e pluribus unum, out of many one." Turn the time back over to you, John.
Thank you so much. Maybe another round of applause.